medical journal, The Lancet, talks about falling birth rates. It talks about them falling across the Western world, but of course it talks also about the really quite steep decline here in this country. And it says that the only way we can deal with this is through open immigration. Otherwise, the magazine says, we won't be able to sustain economic growth. But they do concede that it will lead to staggering social change. Yet, an ever-increasing number of people are not working. They're being registered as disabled. And most of them are for reasons of mental health. And it's extraordinary. They can get an extra £390 a month if they register with mental illness. And they don't even have to go out and look for a job. This is 14 times the number anticipated by the government when it put in this category called substantial risk of mental health problems in 2011. And into all of this, the Pensions Minister, and I have to say, Mel Stride, full of marks to you, has said we should not let normal life anxieties be classified as mental health problems, and that the whole thing has gone too far, and he believes we need to get a chunk of those who are claiming these benefits back into the workplace. I have to say, it's not always that I sit here and agree 100% with ministers, but I do on this one love to get your thoughts. Should we get more people back into the workplace who are registered right now as having mental health issues? Or is that, frankly, just too tough and unpleasant in 2024? Farage at GBNews.com. Please give me your thoughts. Now, I'm joined by Paul Morland, demographer. Paul, give us the facts. Let's talk the UK to begin with.
Yes.
Give us the facts.
The facts are that we've had 50 years of what's known as below replacement fertility rate. That means a couple doesn't have slightly more than two kids. Technically, it's slightly more than two, but effectively you can think of it as two,
yep,
in a world where almost all kids make it to adulthood. And that's been going on since the early 70s. And that's been accumulating a problem. It meant that when we joined the workforce in the 80s, there were lots of us late baby boomers coming through. There weren't that many older people retiring because that cohort had been small, there'd been population growth, but eventually it catches up with you. And that means that even though we've got sluggish economic growth and mass immigration, we are short of workers in almost every sector, and it's only going to get worse.
But isn't this a fallacy? You know, when the Lancet talk about open immigration being the only way to sustain economic growth, surely the figures we've seen, the economic figures we've seen over the course of the last 12 to 18 months, actually point out that mass immigration has led to a decrease in productivity, and that whilst GDP, the total sum of the economy, has grown, GDP per capita, i.e. the individual's real wealth, during this period of open immigration, big immigration, is declining.
I think there are two elements. First of all, in terms of immigration, if we focused immigration on where we actually needed the labour, that would not mean the sort of mass immigration we've seen. We are getting lots and lots of immigrants, but they are coming for all sorts of reasons. Many of them are dependents, many of them are supposedly students. So part one is, if you want to fix this problem with immigration, focus on your immigration in that respect. But there's another angle to it, which is there are two ways of fixing this problem. One is, yes, immigration. Mm-hmm. The other is fixing the fertility rate. Now, we have never had a government in all these 50 years of below replacement fertility which has had a view on this, a comment on it. And you may think, oh, it's only people like Viktor Orban and Vladimir Putin and the weird and wonderful dictators, not very wonderful dictators of the left and right of the 30s who worried about these things. Actually, Macron sees it as a major issue, and you couldn't be much more centrist than him. So I think urgently and much too late, we need to bring the debate back to what about actually encouraging people in this country not to just say we're too busy, we're too important, we'll skim off the qualified labour of other countries, but we'll actually do our own bit. We'll raise our own children, we'll educate them, and we'll bring them into the labour force as you and I and a large cohort were brought in back between the 60s and the 80s.
And maybe encourage some who are off work on disability benefits because they're suffering from depression, maybe encourage a few of them to get back to work?
I think that would obviously be wonderful. I do think that we have a relatively high participation rate in the labour force. Back in the 60s, a lot of women didn't work who work now. Back in the 80s, mass unemployment, that's gone. But that's no reason to say, so now we've got all these people with these various mental health problems. A bit beyond my scope, but clearly where you've got a pool of local labour that could go into the workforce, everything you can do to encourage it to go in is very important.
No, it's a very strong point. And I'm joined down the line by Sharon Gafka, campaigner and ambassador for violence against women and girls. And, you know, we've seen this pattern, haven't we? That, 1964, the post-war baby boom ends, but then women become more liberated, women go to work, women choose careers. Paul was making the point just a moment ago that it wouldn't be a bad thing to encourage women to have more children. What's your take on that?
I mean, you only have to spend 5 minutes looking at the news in the morning to understand why women aren't having more children. I'm in my late 20s, coming closer to 30, and my grandparents would have had children and been married by my age. But the older I get, the less interest I have in having a family. And that's because we are seeing things like the motherhood penalty, where there is a disparity between the salaries of women who have children before they're 42 and women who are of a similar education that don't have children. I think it's a 15% difference, and 80% of the gender wage gap is actually contributed down to the fact that women have children. And I don't want to have to forego my career. And I'm penalised if I do, and I'm penalised if I don't. And then we're looking at a childcare crisis. Many providers saying that they can't keep up with the demand. Many people saying that it costs more to send their child to nursery than it does to pay the mortgage on their home. So I actually think if we want to have women having children like myself, then we need to give proper policy in place for those women to be able to maintain their careers and a family life.
OK, so if government was to say, right, this really is a priority, and Paul has given us reasons why perhaps it should be a priority. And I absolutely get your point about childcare. It's so expensive, it's almost not worth going out to work in many cases. If the government did find a way somehow of making life easier for those that wanted to have children in terms of the cost, do you think it would encourage more women to have children?
I mean, it may encourage more women to have children. I wouldn't encourage me to have a child. I think that there is a wider societal issue as to the reason why I don't want to have children. I mean, I very recently was in the dating pool, and a lot of the times there's a phrase now online that we call single married mothers, where women are expected to maintain all of the unpaid labour in their home and in their families and in the workplace. And then you're penalised by society if you can't maintain both or either. So I think for me, it wouldn't encourage me at all.
And Sharon, for somebody in their 20s, what Mel Stride said at the dispatch box today, the minister, overseeing pensions and work, he said that what would be just normal life crises that happen to all of us are now being categorised as being mental health issues, and there are financial incentives in some ways for people to go onto that disability register to get an extra £390 a month. And it's mostly young people this is happening to. Is there some way, should there be some way, that we say to young people, look, you're suffering from short-term upset, trauma, loss, depression. It happens to every one of us in our life at some point. And actually what you need to do is pick yourself up and get back to work and be fulfilled rather than going on benefits. Or am I saying something that sounds to you that it's completely outdated?
I mean, in some aspects, I consider it to be outdated. I can understand that. Well, we have to look at what we consider the normal anxieties of life. When my dad was my age, it was a lot easier to buy a home. If you went to university, it pretty much guaranteed you a graduate job. Not so much now for young people. And then when you're looking at wanting to start a family, it's too expensive. If you want to look at going on holiday, it's too expensive. The cost of living, it's too expensive. I can empathise and understand why a lot of young people are suffering from mental health problems. And when you want to access mental health facilities, the funding isn't there. So a lot of people are now turning to self-diagnosis. I mean, this is like, the guest said, this is very much out of my scope because I'm not a mental health practitioner. No. But, I've seen lots of young people who working in the NHS, for example, on the front line during COVID, who had to sign off of mental health illnesses because we weren't looking after them when they were in the workforce. And then their affordability to be able to live like an adult the same way our parents did is drastically different. So unless there's a massive change in the way that we look at young people, parenting, motherhood, and the economy, this is unfortunately how it has to be in terms of living now.
Sharon Gafka, thank you for joining me here on GB News. So to come back to you, Paul, you know, Sharon making her points quite strongly and passionately there about, you know, her choice not to have children, her point about the cost of childcare. And I guess she does have a very good point that in the 50s and 60s, most houses had one income and could live perfectly reasonably, not, you know, in the lap of luxury, but perfectly reasonably. And now it's quite tough, isn't it, if you've got children, to run a household without both of you working?
Well, it is tough. On the other hand, why is it the case that when we have never been better off economically as a society, indeed all rich societies are having this problem, we say we're now richer than we have been, but we can't afford children? I do think it's about people's priorities and it's about what people want to do with their lives. I totally support the idea of helping women combine work with childbearing. In fact, that's absolutely critical. That's the only way we'll solve this problem. I do believe in helping young families with housing and childcare, but we need to be careful. That's a good in itself. Parts of Scotland have got quite cheap housing. Germany has very cheap childcare. Both places have got really low fertility. So we should absolutely be supporting the young families. We should be supporting women to combine career and family, but don't think that's itself going to solve the problem. What we actually need is a real change of our priorities as a society.
Paul Morland, thank you for joining me. Well, it is a fascinating debate and it's one that won't go away. I do not believe that more mass immigration is the solution.